A simple man walked into a car dealership, and no one realized he was Paul McCartney, a music legend and the secret owner of the place. But when he heard the sobs of an elderly couple being lowballed on the last keepsake of their late son, he knew he couldn't stay silent. Before we dive deeper into this heartfelt story, let us know where you're watching from, and make sure to hit that subscribe button. Tomorrow, we'll share another incredible story that will touch your heart and inspire your soul. It was a peaceful morning. The golden sunlight bathed rows of gleaming cars, their polished surfaces sparkling like treasures under the clear blue sky. Inside the bustling showroom, the air buzzed with energy. Salespeople in crisp suits, their polished smiles and smooth words crafting perfect performances to close the next big deal. Everything felt fast-paced, calculated, and unapologetically focused on profit. Amid this scene, a man entered quietly, blending seamlessly into the crowd. He wore a simple beanie and dark sunglasses, his casual demeanor making him indistinguishable from any other customer browsing the lot. But what no one realized was that this was Paul McCartney, the legendary musician and the secret owner of the dealership. Paul had never been the kind to crave the spotlight when it came to business. As a silent investor, he had entrusted the management of his dealership to others, hoping his values of fairness and integrity would guide its operations. But troubling whispers had reached his ears. Stories of unfair deals, cold-hearted sales tactics, and customers walking away feeling betrayed. As he stepped inside, Paul couldn't ignore the heaviness in his chest. Had this place lost the values I believed in? He wondered. Was it still a business built on trust, or just another cog in the wheel of greed? He wasn't here just to observe. He was here to uncover the truth. Little did he know, this visit would reveal far more than the state of his dealership. It would test his beliefs, his resolve, and everything he stood for. Paul stood quietly by the entrance, his figure unassuming, almost invisible amidst the activity of the showroom. The polished floors gleamed under the bright lights, and rows of pristine cars lined the space like a display of treasures. But beneath the glossy exterior, there was something that felt off. He let his eyes wander, taking in every detail. The salespeople moved with precision, their every step deliberate, their every smile rehearsed. It wasn't warmth, it was routine. Their polite greetings and practiced handshakes were flawless, yet lacked sincerity. Paul's chest tightened. This wasn't the place I envisioned. He remembered the pride he once felt in building a business grounded in fairness and trust. But now, it felt like those values had been replaced by cold, mechanical efficiency. He shifted his gaze to the customers. A young couple hesitated near a sleek red sedan, their hopeful expressions dimming as the salesperson rattled off terms that seemed anything but reasonable. Across the room, another customer fidgeted nervously while a sharply dressed man in a suit pointed at a clipboard, his voice smooth but devoid of genuine concern. Despite the bustling energy, Paul could feel an underlying tension. It clung to the air like an invisible weight. Was this how we treated people now? He wondered. Had the heart of this place been lost in the pursuit of profit? Just as he turned to inspect another car, a sound caught his attention. A voice, trembling and raw with emotion, broke through the hum of the showroom. It was soft but distinct, a plea wrapped in desperation. Paul froze, his senses sharpening. He scanned the room, his gaze landing on the trade-in desk. An older couple stood there, their posture heavy with unease. Something about their presence pulled at him, an unspoken sorrow that hung in the air like a storm waiting to break. He took a slow step forward, his curiosity piqued, but his heart already bracing for what he might uncover. The trembling voice grew clearer as Paul moved closer to the trade-in desk. It was the kind of voice that carried a weight of sorrow, one that stopped him in his tracks. Standing by the counter was an elderly couple. The man, tall but slightly hunched with age, had a tired expression etched across his face. His hands, rough and trembling, gripped a small stack of papers tightly. Beside him, a woman clung to his arm, her face pale and lined with worry. "We've kept it as long as we could," the woman said, her voice breaking mid-sentence. She looked at the car parked just outside the showroom, a modest, older sedan, its paint faded from years of sun and rain. Paul noticed how her gaze lingered on the car, not with the usual reluctance of someone parting with an old possession, but with a deep, painful longing. It wasn't just a car to them, it was something far more significant. The man cleared his throat, his words heavy with hesitation. "This car belonged to our son," he said softly. "He was a firefighter, a hero in our community." His voice faltered for a moment, and he swallowed hard. He didn't make it back. Paul felt his chest tighten. He instinctively reached for the sunglasses on his face, as if hiding his own emotions might help him process theirs. "We've tried everything," the woman continued, tears welling in her eyes. "But the repairs, we just can't afford them anymore. It's the only thing we have left of him, but—" Her voice cracked, and she quickly dabbed her eyes with a tissue. Paul's gaze shifted between the couple and the car outside. He could see the small firefighter's decal on the back window, a quiet reminder of their son's legacy. The weight of their story pressed down on him, mingling sorrow with a rising sense of anger. How could anyone see this couple, hear their story, and still treat them like just another transaction? As Paul stood there, unnoticed, his mind raced. This wasn't just about money or a car. This was about respect, about preserving something that held the last pieces of a life lived with purpose. He knew he had to do something. Standing behind the counter, Rick Larson exuded the kind of confidence that came with years of closing deals. His suit was sharp, his tie perfectly knotted, and his expression carried a practiced air of authority. But as Paul watched him interact with the elderly couple, there was something unsettling about his demeanor, cold, detached, and entirely transactional. Rick glanced at the paperwork in his hand, barely looking up at the couple in front of him. His voice was calm, clipped, and devoid of empathy. "This car," he said, tapping the appraisal sheet, "isn't worth much. It's old, the mileage is high, and the repairs, not cheap." The woman's lips quivered, and she tried to explain, her words trembling with desperation. "It's not just a car to us. It's the only thing we have left of our son." Rick didn't even flinch. Instead, he let out a small, exasperated sigh and leaned back slightly, folding his arms across his chest. "I understand it has sentimental value," he said, his tone flat. "But unfortunately, feelings don't add dollars to the market price." Paul's hands clenched at his sides. He could feel the rising tension in the air. The quiet anguish of the couple contrasted sharply with Rick's indifferent tone. Rick continued, flipping the paper over and gesturing to the final number. $2,000. That's the best I can do. Honestly, you're lucky I'm offering that much." His words landed like stones in the quiet space between them. The woman's eyes filled with tears as her husband placed a steadying hand on her shoulder. But Paul couldn't take his eyes off Rick, off the way he seemed utterly unaffected by the raw pain in front of him. It wasn't just the low offer that gnawed at Paul. It was the sheer lack of humanity. This wasn't how people were supposed to be treated, especially not here, in a place he had once hoped would stand for something better. The mother took a shaky breath, her fingers gripping the edge of the counter as though it was the only thing keeping her upright. Her eyes darted to the car parked outside, a modest, aging sedan with a firefighter's decal on the back window. She tried to speak, but her voice cracked under the weight of her emotions. "This car," she began, her tone trembling. "It's all we have left of him." She paused, pressing a tissue to her eyes, but the tears came anyway, spilling over despite her effort to stay composed. Her husband stood beside her, his hand resting protectively on her shoulder. His face was set in a stoic mask, but the faint quiver of his lips betrayed the storm of grief beneath the surface. He swallowed hard before speaking, his voice low and steady. "Our son was a firefighter. He gave everything for this community." His words faltered, but he forced himself to continue. "When we lost him, we just couldn't let go of the car. It was his pride and joy." Paul's gaze followed theirs to the car outside, its faded paint and worn tires telling a story of years gone by. To anyone else, it was just an old vehicle. But to this couple, it was a lifeline, an irreplaceable connection to a son who was no longer here. "We've tried to hold on to it as long as we could," the mother continued, her voice breaking with every word. "But the repairs are too much, and the medical bills." She trailed off, her voice collapsing into a whisper. The man squeezed her shoulder gently, his jaw tightening as he looked down at the papers in his hand. "It's like losing him all over again," he murmured, his voice barely audible. Paul's chest tightened as their words hit him like a tidal wave. He could feel the anguish in their voices, the quiet desperation that hung in the air. He glanced back at Rick, whose indifferent expression remained unchanged, and then back at the couple. This wasn't just a trade-in. This wasn't just business. This was a test, a moment that demanded more than numbers on a piece of paper. Paul knew he had to act. Paul stood motionless for a moment, his heart heavy with what he had just witnessed. The anguish etched on the couple's faces, the trembling in their voices, it was too much to bear. He couldn't stand idly by. Taking a steady breath, Paul stepped forward, his calm demeanor masking the fire that was building inside him. His footsteps were deliberate yet quiet, as if he didn't want to alarm the already shaken couple. "Excuse me," Paul said gently, his voice warm and steady, cutting through the tension in the room. The couple turned toward him, their tear-streaked faces filled with a mix of surprise and unease. "I couldn't help but overhear," Paul continued, his gaze soft but sincere. "I'm so sorry for what you're going through. Your son must have been an incredible man." The woman clutched her husband's arm a little tighter, her lips quivering as she tried to respond. He loved that car. It was his pride." Her voice broke, and she looked down, unable to continue. Paul nodded, his heart aching as he listened. "I understand how much this means to you," he said, his voice low and full of empathy. "It's not just a car. It's a piece of him. A piece of your family." The man's eyes softened slightly, and he gave a small nod of agreement. Paul could see how hard he was trying to stay strong for his wife, even as the weight of their grief bore down on him. Paul glanced at the appraisal papers on the counter, then back at the couple. "Sometimes, it feels like the things we care about most are reduced to numbers on a page," he said, his tone shifting, almost reflective. "But that's not how it should be. Not here." As the couple exchanged a glance, Paul could see a flicker of hope in their eyes. He wasn't sure what he could do yet, but he knew one thing for certain: he wouldn't let them walk out of here feeling like this. Rick Larson looked up from the counter, his sharp features hardening the moment Paul stepped in. His polished smile flickered, replaced by a faint shadow of irritation. Taking a measured breath, Rick straightened his tie, the practiced movements of a man who prided himself on control. "Sir," Rick began, his tone polite but clipped, "this is a private matter between the dealership and these customers." He gestured dismissively toward the couple, who now seemed even smaller under his scrutiny. "I assure you, everything is being handled fairly and professionally." Paul didn't respond immediately. He stood steady, his calm gaze fixed on Rick. Rick's polite veneer cracked. He leaned slightly forward, lowering his voice as if to assert dominance. "Look," he said sharply, his frustration beginning to seep through. "I understand you might mean well, but this really isn't your concern. You're just a customer. You wouldn't understand how we do things here." Paul's expression didn't change, but Rick's words struck a nerve. Just a customer. The phrase lingered in the air, heavy and dismissive, as if Paul's presence was an inconvenience rather than a challenge to Rick's authority. For a moment, Paul glanced at the elderly couple. The woman's hands trembled as she clung to her husband's arm. Her eyes darted between Paul and Rick, unsure whether to hope for intervention or brace for disappointment. Paul turned back to Rick, his tone measured but unwavering. "I see," he said softly, tilting his head ever so slightly. "And how exactly do you define fairness here?" Rick hesitated, caught off guard by the calm but pointed question. He quickly recovered, his shoulders squaring as he gave a tight, controlled response. "Fairness," he said, his voice growing firmer, "means offering the best market price for the vehicle. Sentiment doesn't pay the bills, sir." His words landed with a cold finality, hanging in the air like a barrier between him and everyone else. Paul's jaw tightened imperceptibly. He glanced at the couple again, at the woman fighting back tears, at the man trying to appear strong but unable to hide the cracks in his composure. Paul could feel the weight of their silent despair pressing against him, their grief magnified by Rick's indifference. This wasn't just about a car. It wasn't even about business. It was about values, about humanity. Paul straightened his posture, his calm exterior hiding the storm building within. He was done waiting. It was time to speak. Paul stood still for a moment, his gaze unwavering as Rick's words echoed through the room. The tension was palpable, every eye subtly darting toward the interaction. Then, with a calm and deliberate motion, Paul reached up and removed his sunglasses, revealing his unmistakable face. "You're mistaken," Paul said, his voice steady but firm, carrying an authority that cut through the room like a knife. "I'm not just a customer, I'm the owner of this dealership." The room seemed to hold its breath. Rick's confident smirk vanished in an instant, replaced by a mix of disbelief and unease. His posture stiffened as if the very ground beneath him had shifted. Around them, employees froze mid-motion, their curiosity barely masked as they pretended to continue their tasks. Some leaned in slightly, their eyes wide with a mixture of shock and anticipation. Paul stepped forward, his movements measured, his gaze fixed on Rick. "I'm the one who built this business," he began, his voice calm but heavy with meaning. "Years ago, I invested in this dealership, trusting that it would operate with fairness, respect, and integrity. Those were the values that mattered to me, the values I believed in." Rick opened his mouth, but no words came out. His hands tightened around the edge of the counter, the confidence he once displayed now unraveling. Paul turned his gaze toward the employees, his tone softening but still resolute. "I stepped back from the day-to-day operations because I believed those values would carry on without me. But today?" He glanced briefly at the elderly couple, their grief-stricken faces watching him with cautious hope. "It's clear to me that we've lost sight of what matters most." The weight of his words settled over the room, pressing down like a quiet storm. The employees exchanged uncertain glances, some fidgeting nervously while others seemed almost relieved, as if they had been waiting for this moment. Paul turned back to Rick, his expression unreadable but his voice unwavering. "I've seen the reports, the numbers. But numbers don't tell the whole story. People do." Rick shifted uncomfortably, his carefully constructed facade crumbling under the intensity of Paul's words. Paul gestured toward the couple, his tone soft but firm. "This isn't just a car to them, it's a memory, a connection to someone they loved and lost. And this," he paused, gesturing around the room, "this isn't just a business. It's a place where people should feel valued, not dismissed because, as you say, sentiment doesn't pay the bills." The silence that followed was deafening. Every eye was on Paul now, hanging on to his every word. He stood tall, his presence commanding yet compassionate, a stark contrast to the cold indifference that had ruled the room moments before. Paul turned to the elderly couple, their faces still etched with disbelief and cautious hope. He gave them a reassuring smile and spoke gently, his tone carrying the warmth of sincerity. "Let me buy the car," Paul said. "Not at the price Rick offered, but for what it's truly worth, and more." The woman gasped softly, her hand flying to her mouth as tears welled up in her eyes. The man gripped her shoulder, his own voice shaking as he asked, You'd really do that?" Paul nodded firmly. "Absolutely. Your son's legacy deserves respect, and so do you." He turned to an employee standing nearby and gestured toward the trade-in desk. "Write them a check for $10,000, Paul instructed. The employee hesitated for a moment, stunned, before hurrying to carry out the order. The showroom fell into a stunned silence, broken only by the sound of the woman's quiet sobs. She clutched Paul's hand tightly, her voice trembling as she whispered, "Thank you. You have no idea what this means to us." Paul gave her hand a comforting squeeze before shifting his gaze back to Rick. His demeanor changed instantly, his warm expression replaced by a steely resolve. "Rick Larson," Paul said, his voice firm and commanding. "You're relieved of your duties, effective immediately." Rick's face paled, his mouth opening and closing as he struggled for words. "But you can't just—" "I can, and I will," Paul interrupted, his tone unwavering. "This dealership has no place for someone who sees customers as mere numbers. Pack your things and leave." Rick's shoulders slumped as the weight of Paul's authority bore down on him. He glanced around but found no support from the employees who had been silently watching. Defeated, he gave a small, bitter nod and walked out, his footsteps heavy against the polished floor. Paul turned to the employees, who were now gathered in a loose semicircle, their expressions a mix of curiosity and uncertainty. He took a deep breath, letting the weight of the moment settle over him. "This ends today," Paul began, his voice carrying across the room. "No more dishonesty. No more pressure tactics. From now on, we do things differently." He gestured to the couple, who were still standing by the desk, their check in hand. "This is what we stand for: respect, fairness, and integrity. Starting today, there will be no hidden fees, no misleading deals. Every transaction will be transparent." The employees shifted, exchanging glances as Paul continued. "And the way we reward success will change too. From now on, your commissions will be based on customer satisfaction, not just sales volume. When our customers leave here happy, we all succeed." A ripple of murmurs spread through the room. Some employees looked thoughtful, others hesitant, but a few nodded, their faces showing the first signs of relief and hope. Paul finished with a calm but resolute tone. "This is more than a dealership. It's a reflection of the values we stand for, and I expect everyone here to live up to those values. If you can't, this isn't the place for you." The room was silent for a moment, the gravity of Paul's words sinking in. Then, a lone voice spoke up, a young salesman near the back. "Thank you," he said quietly, his voice steady but filled with conviction. "It's about time." Paul gave him a small nod, the faintest trace of a smile touching his lips. "Let's rebuild this place the right way," he said. For a moment the room was silent, the weight of Paul's words lingering in the air. Then, slowly, a young salesman near the back stepped forward. His face was hesitant, his voice quiet but steady. "Mr. McCartney," he began, his eyes flickering with both uncertainty and relief, I wanted to say thank you. Rick, he made it hard for us to do the right thing." Paul turned to the young man, his expression softening. "What do you mean?" he asked gently, inviting him to continue. The salesman shifted uncomfortably, glancing around as if to gauge the reactions of his colleagues. Finally he spoke, his words tumbling out like a confession. "He pressured us to close deals, no matter what it took. If we didn't hit our quotas, he'd humiliate us in front of the team, or worse, threaten our jobs." A ripple of agreement spread through the room. Another employee, a middle-aged woman with a kind but weary face, stepped forward. "It wasn't just the pressure," she added, her voice trembling slightly. "He encouraged us to upsell things customers didn't need. Sometimes, we had to push deals that weren't honest." Her eyes dropped to the floor as she finished, a mix of shame and exhaustion in her tone. Paul's chest tightened at their words. He could feel the frustration, the guilt, and the quiet desperation that had been simmering beneath the surface. He took a slow breath, steadying himself before addressing them. "I'm sorry," Paul said, his voice filled with sincerity. "I didn't know it had gotten this bad, and for that, I take responsibility." He let the words settle for a moment, his gaze sweeping across the room, meeting the eyes of each employee. "But that stops now," he continued, his tone firm but hopeful. "The pressure you felt, the fear of doing the right thing, that's over. From this day forward, we work together to build trust, not break it." A murmur spread through the group, quieter this time, tinged with relief. Some employees exchanged glances, their postures loosening as if a weight had been lifted. Paul raised his voice slightly, ensuring every word resonated. "I'm not here to blame anyone for what's happened, but I am here to make sure it doesn't happen again. If you're willing to embrace this change, to focus on honesty and respect, then I promise you this: we'll build something we can all be proud of." The young salesman from earlier gave a small nod, his expression softening. "Thank you," he said again, his voice steadier this time. "It's what we've needed for a long time." Paul smiled faintly, his tone calm but resolute. "Then let's get to work," he said. News of Paul's reforms at the dealership spread quickly. Stories of his decision to help the elderly couple and implement transparent business practices began circulating among customers. While the community buzzed with hope and admiration, the news didn't sit well with Michael Langford, the owner of a rival dealership known for his aggressive sales tactics and questionable ethics. Langford seized the opportunity to strike. In an interview with a local news outlet, he delivered his criticism with a smug smile, leaning back in his chair as if he already held the upper hand. "Let's not be fooled by the theatrics," he said, his tone dripping with mockery. "Paul McCartney is just trying to shine his halo. This is nothing more than a publicity stunt to salvage his image. Meanwhile, my business focuses on what matters: low prices and high sales." His words spread quickly, fueling a heated debate in the community. Some doubted Paul's sincerity, while others rallied to his defense. But Paul, true to his nature, didn't react with outrage or impulsivity. Instead, he took a measured approach. He decided to address the matter publicly, on his terms. The following afternoon, reporters, customers, and employees gathered in the bright, sunlit showroom. Cameras flashed, microphones were positioned, and anticipation filled the air. Paul stood at the center, exuding calm confidence. "Thank you all for coming today," Paul began, his voice steady and clear, yet carrying an undercurrent of warmth. "I know there have been questions, doubts even, about what we're doing here, so I want to address them directly, with complete transparency." The room quieted as he continued. "Yes, I'll admit it. This dealership has made mistakes in the past. Somewhere along the way, the values that were meant to guide us, fairness, honesty, and respect, were overshadowed by the pressure to maximize numbers. And that's on me. As the owner, I take full responsibility." A murmur rippled through the room, the weight of Paul's admission settling over the crowd. "But today," Paul continued, his voice rising slightly, "is not about making excuses. It's about making things right. From this moment forward, our focus will be on building trust, not just selling cars. Every transaction will be transparent, every customer treated with the dignity they deserve. This isn't just a business decision. It's a commitment to the values that should define us." Paul let his words hang in the air for a moment before addressing the elephant in the room. "I've heard what Michael Langford had to say about me. He called this a publicity stunt, a way to polish my image." He paused, his gaze steady, his tone unwavering. "If helping people and doing the right thing is a publicity stunt, then I'll wear that label with pride. But let me be clear. Honesty isn't a gimmick. It's not a performance. It's the foundation of a sustainable business, and it's what people deserve." A wave of murmurs spread through the audience. One reporter raised her hand and asked, "What makes you confident this approach will work when Langford insists that only low prices and high sales matter?" Paul smiled faintly, his demeanor calm but resolute. "Because people are more than numbers. They remember how you treat them. Trust builds loyalty, and loyalty sustains a business far longer than flashy discounts or high-pressure tactics ever could." The clicks of cameras filled the room as Paul concluded. "At the end of the day, our actions will speak louder than any words, and I'm willing to let those actions prove everything I've said here today." As the event wrapped up, customers approached Paul, shaking his hand and offering words of encouragement. An older woman with silver hair reached out, her voice trembling with emotion. "Thank you, Mr. McCartney," she said. "It's been so long since I've seen someone in your position truly care about people. It gives me hope." Paul smiled warmly, gripping her hand gently. "It's not just me," he replied. "It's all of us. Together, we can make this a place we're proud of." Nearby, employees exchanged glances, their postures more relaxed than they'd been in weeks. One whispered to another, "This is exactly what we needed." As the crowd dispersed, Paul took a quiet moment to reflect. He knew this wasn't the end of the challenges he'd face. Langford wouldn't back down easily. But the momentum was shifting, and Paul was ready to lead the fight for something greater than sales: integrity. The impact of Paul's press conference was immediate and profound. By the following morning, the dealership's phone lines were ringing non-stop. Customers who had walked away disappointed in the past were calling back, curious about the changes they had heard about. At the front desk, a receptionist greeted a middle-aged man who had returned with paperwork in hand. "I bought a car here 2 years ago," he said hesitantly. "It was supposed to be a fair deal, but, well, let's just say it didn't feel that way. I saw the press conference, and I thought I'd give it another shot." Moments like this became common as word spread about Paul's reforms. In just days, former customers trickled in, some skeptical but hopeful, others cautiously optimistic. Paul wasn't content to let these moments play out without personal involvement. Taking a seat in his office, he began making phone calls himself. The sound of the phone ringing filled the quiet office. On the other end, a woman answered, her tone reserved. "Mrs. Thompson?" Paul said warmly. "This is Paul McCartney, the owner of the dealership." There was a pause, followed by a wary, "Yes?" "I wanted to personally apologize for the way you were treated when you bought your car here," Paul continued. "It was wrong, and I take full responsibility. I'd like to make things right if you'll allow me to." Mrs. Thompson's voice softened. I wasn't expecting this, she admitted, but thank you. It means a lot to hear that. Paul spent hours that week making similar calls, addressing the grievances of customers who had been let down. For every story of frustration, Paul offered an apology, a solution, and a renewed promise that things would be different. Meanwhile, new faces began appearing in the showroom. A young couple walked in, their smiles tentative but hopeful. "We heard about what you're doing here," the man said to one of the sales staff. "We've been looking for a dealership we can trust. It feels like this might be the place." The atmosphere in the dealership began to change. Employees carried themselves with a newfound pride, their interactions with customers more genuine, less pressured. Small gestures, an honest explanation of financing terms, a helpful test drive, a sincere thank you, started to rebuild the trust that had been lost. Each day brought more customers, some looking to buy, others simply curious. But the buzz in the community was undeniable. Paul McCartney was not only reforming his business, but setting a new standard for what a dealership could be. Several weeks had passed since Paul had helped the elderly couple. The dealership was buzzing with new energy. Employees were more engaged, customers were returning, and a sense of optimism filled the air. Amid the daily hustle, Paul received a package that immediately caught his attention. The envelope was simple, with neat handwriting that seemed deliberate and careful. Paul's name was written on the front, and when he opened it, he found a handwritten letter and a photograph. The photograph showed a gleaming car, fully restored to its former glory. The paint shone under the sunlight, and the firefighter decal on the back window stood out as a proud symbol. Paul unfolded the letter, his eyes scanning the words written in the same careful script. "Dear Mr. McCartney, we can't thank you enough for what you did for us. That day at the dealership, we felt like we had reached the end of the road, but your kindness gave us a reason to hope again. The car you bought from us wasn't just a car, it was a part of our son, a reminder of the sacrifices he made and the life he lived. Thanks to your help, we were able to restore it completely. It now sits in our driveway, shining as brightly as the memories we hold of him. You didn't just buy a car that day, you gave us something much greater. You reminded us that there are still good people in this world, people who care. We know our son would be proud of what you did, just as we are. You've given us more than we could ever repay, and for that we will always be grateful. Sincerely, Harold and Linda Carter." Paul read the letter twice, then a third time, his chest tightening with emotion. He stared at the photograph, imagining the journey the couple had taken to bring the car back to life. It wasn't just a vehicle anymore. It was a symbol of resilience, love, and hope. He set the letter down carefully, his mind replaying the moment he had met Harold and Linda. Their trembling voices, the pain in their eyes, it was all still vivid. But now there was something else. Their story had come full circle, and knowing he had played a part in it filled him with quiet pride. Paul called for a meeting with his team later that day. Holding up the photograph for everyone to see, he shared the story behind it, his voice steady but filled with emotion. "This," he said, gesturing to the picture, "is why we do what we do. It's not just about selling cars or hitting numbers. It's about making a difference in people's lives." The room was silent as his words sank in, the photograph serving as a powerful reminder of the values Paul had worked so hard to restore. As the evening sun cast its warm glow over the city, Paul McCartney sat alone in his music room. The polished keys of a grand piano gleamed softly under the dim light. Paul's fingers moved instinctively, playing a gentle, familiar melody that filled the quiet space. Each note carried a sense of reflection, as if the music itself were telling the story of the journey he had just undertaken. The events of the past weeks replayed in his mind, the elderly couple's tearful gratitude, the hesitant but hopeful smiles of returning customers, the renewed energy among his employees. He thought about the challenges he had faced, the doubt, the criticism, the moments of uncertainty. Yet, amidst it all, there was a profound sense of fulfillment. Paul's hands paused on the keys. He stared at them for a moment, his reflection visible in the glossy black surface of the piano. Then, almost to himself, he whispered, "It's not fame. It's not fortune. True success is measured by the lives we touch, by the changes we inspire in others. He closed his eyes for a moment, letting the weight of those words settle in his heart. The melody resumed, softer now, as if echoing the peace and clarity he felt in that moment. Paul glanced at a framed photograph resting on the piano, a snapshot of the elderly couple standing proudly beside their fully restored car. Next to it was a letter from a young employee who had thanked Paul for giving him a workplace he could finally believe in. This, Paul thought, his chest tightening with emotion, this is what matters. It wasn't the numbers or the accolades. It wasn't the headlines or the public praise. It was the quiet moments, the unseen ripples of change that spread far beyond the walls of the dealership. Paul played the final note, letting it linger in the air. The room fell silent, but his heart was anything but. It beat with a sense of purpose that no amount of fame could ever replicate. In the days that followed, Paul's commitment to his values only grew stronger. The dealership became more than just a place to buy cars. It became a symbol of trust, integrity, and hope. Customers left with more than vehicles. They left with a renewed faith in the goodness of people. Employees found meaning in their work, knowing they were part of something larger than themselves. And Paul? He found something he had been searching for all along. A legacy built not on fame, but on compassion and purpose. Thank you for watching this heartfelt story. If it touched your heart, please give this video a like and share it with someone who might need a little inspiration today. Don't forget to hit that subscribe button so you won't miss more meaningful stories like this. Your support means the world to us and keeps our team motivated to bring you more content that inspires, uplifts, and connects. Together, let's keep spreading positivity.